I think it's great reason to start a startup. And I really don't want to dissuade people, but I feel like it's the
Mm.
catalyst, right? It's kind of like, oh, it's gonna be a grand adventure, and then like you step in, and then now you're like, crap, I'm in this gigantic forest of
Yeah.
nothingness. What do I do? I think the primary reason why you should start a startup is because there's a really big problem that just like irks you. If you don't do it, someone else is going to do it. Or sorry, if you don't do it, you think nobody else is going to do it. Like you feel like you're the only one out there who kind of like either recognizes the problem or has the like chops to go fix it. And so typically, and when we invest in founders, we're kind of like looking for that. And I feel like when we started companies, we try to make that one of the reasons why we're starting a
But
startup.
that's kind of tough, right? Because it's like, I mean, for most problems and most people, it's like they're not the only person that can kind of like solve this. There's like a rare breed of people that kind of like solve that. Like, I've actually never liked that reason. And part of the reason why I don't like that reason is I just think it's unrealistic. Like, I think there's just a lot of problems that many people can solve. And it's like, I'm not the only person that can see it. I'm not the only person that can kind of like solve it. And so I guess there's two parts to it. There's one that is like, you just can't stand this problem and you're like, I'm going to do something about it. Like, there are other people that can do something about it, but they're not doing anything, so like, screw it, I'm going to do it. There's like that piece, and then there's like the what other piece that is like, I'm the only person in the world that can do this thing and I need to save the world, so I'm going to like do that. So I think there's like two parts to that.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe. I mean, it's not. You're right. You're right. Like the latter. It's not the
Yeah.
latter. It's the former. Right. It's like there's a problem. It doesn't matter if anyone else is doing it. You're like, I have to solve this problem. Right. Is kind of like what I think is a good reason.
I think one of the things that we talk about with companies in the batch too is that oftentimes really, really good startups and kind of really good founders, it almost, the way they talk about what they're doing, it almost sounds that they're like on a crusade. Like they're like righting some wrong in the world and they like can't kind of like do anything else until they like right that wrong. So I think that's kind of like what you're talking about a little bit. Which I think in large part is actually why we started Iterative. We were just like, hey, in Southeast Asia, these founders aren't getting kind of the support we're looking for. And like, I remember you asking me about it, and I just was like, I just would get super pissed and just be like, can you believe this is happening? I can't believe this doesn't happen or whatever. And I think so. Iterative was probably that for me. But it sounds like a crusade,
Yeah.
I think, a lot of
Yeah.
times.
We're all saying this, but like the anger or the frustration kind of like feeling that you have, right, is a
Yeah.
good sign you're onto not you're onto something, but you're onto something that you feel like you want to
Yep.
that can last. Because typically like you get lost in the startup journey very often, and you can come back to this kind of like initial impulse or feeling.
That's actually a really interesting thing to kind of frame this conversation too, because like part of what you're looking for is like startups are really hard, and we'll talk about why startups are hard and all that kind of stuff. But you're almost looking for like you need enough reason or compulsion to like go through all the hard stuff, and so that needs to come from somewhere, and it needs to be like sufficient. And so I think that's like a good way to kind of frame this on some level. Um, Maybe let me go to one of mine from the list that I think resonates with you and I quite a lot. You and I are quite big into kind of like personal growth and development and all that stuff. And I often think that startups are a really good, they're to me probably the best way to kind of like develop professionally and kind of like learn things and all of that stuff. And so I think in large part, I don't know if you agree with this. I've always thought this about us, that part of the reason why we wanted to do a startup is because it was such a good opportunity to kind of like learn and grow, especially when we started and we were like 22 or something like that. We were like, if we do a startup, it'll like fast forward our careers by like 10 years and we'll learn a bunch of stuff and whatever. Does this resonate with you?
I don't know if I agree with fast forward your career because I feel like you chose a
Yeah.
different path than a lot of other people are going to take, and I don't know if it's like that likely that you'll like get back
It's
into
a
like a big
different
company or
career
industry or
path.
whatever. But yeah,
Yeah.
a different career path. But I do think I think what resonates is it is one of the like
Mm.
steepest
Mhm.
learning curves, and there's certain types of people that really really enjoy steep learning curves, just because you like learn so much. And this I think this happens in a lot of kind of like complex I don't know, math, right? Like if you want to go really deep into math, and there's like a steep learning curve there, or like I don't know, there's you can name a number of things, but building startups ends up being one of the steepest learning curves of anything I think you can do with your life, and certain types of people gravitate towards that.
Um, Short aside, why do you think it's so steep? I mean, I obviously 100% agree with you, but like, why do you think it's so steep comparative to like other things that you could do?
I think maybe it's because you just have to learn so many things in a very short amount of time, right? Like you have to learn how to do product, do engineering, do marketing, work with, and things change all the time, right? Like new technologies come, and then you need to understand business and marketing, and you weren't trained on any of this stuff. That's kind of like one part. Work with people, be a good like founding CEO, like all this kind of stuff. And it would be fine if you had time, but you don't have time. Like every single day you're dying, and so you're like, what do I need to learn and get better at
I
today?
sometimes with the way you're talking about it, makes me think about like it's almost like you get dropped in this like jungle, and the jungle is like really efficient. And in order like when you do a startup, you get dropped in this jungle. You kind of don't know how anything works. You're like your startup is close to death at any moment. You have to like there's a lot of pressure to kind of like figure it out, and I think that pressure just makes you have to be very kind of efficient and learn a lot. And so I feel like it's that kind of curve. I feel like maybe other things, it's like they're just more friendly environments. Like there's more guardrails. People tell you what to do. Whereas startups is just like, hey, there's this really competitive jungle, and it's like really tough. We're just going to drop you in that. Hope you figure it out. And if you can kind of like take that, I think then you kind of learn a lot. Okay, one more reason from you, and then I'll get one more reason.
Sure. I like the
Mm,
autonomy one, right? Because I think a lot of people are like, "Oh, I don't want a boss. I want to build my own kind of like business, etc." I'm just kind of like someone who isn't good at taking orders. I think it's a good one, but at the same time, I think a lot of people when they first jump in don't realize how much
yeah.
responsibility there is. And so I think it's kind of like a double-edged sword a little bit, right? It's kind of like I'd love to do things by myself, be my own boss, and then all of a sudden you're like working 24/7, right? You're uh trying to figure out what decisions are right. Yeah, working responsibilities, all that kind
I
of
feel
stuff.
like
So
that was definitely like us. We
that's
were
good.
like, oh yeah, I want to be able to kind of like make decisions and have a lot of autonomy and stuff. And I feel like you and I kind of 15 years in are like, oh my gosh, like can other people tell us what to do? I think there's a lot that comes with it. You don't just like get autonomy, and there's no kind of like cost to that, right? So, but I think there is a certain type of person. And I think at the end of the day, you and I are like this, where it's like we're willing to pay the cost for that level of autonomy, and so I think it's like okay for us. Okay.
Yeah. I sorry, my last thing on this one, just because I think it's funny, because everyone's like, "Oh, I would love to not have a 9 to 5 job," and then you end up doing the startup thing, and then you don't realize it's a 9 to 9 job. It's like you're on all the time because you
Are
just
you
can't
like
turn
this
it
with
off.
me? Sometimes I look at people with 9 to 5 jobs. I'm like, it just sounds nice. Like
It would be
be
so
able to
great.
turn. And I
Yeah.
think it's the weird part of this is, and look, 9 to 5 people work hard too. I'm not trying to kind of throw shade at people working 9 to 5, but I think in startups it's really hard to turn it off. So even if I'm like not sitting at my computer working, you're still kind of thinking about stuff, and so it's just hard to turn off. And sometimes I think about jobs where it's like very clear cutoffs, like if you work at a coffee shop and the coffee shop closes at 5, like the coffee shop is closed, you're kind of like you go home and you do something else and you don't think about it, right? And I think that kind of like delineation is like I think important. I'm actually curious what you think about this. I'm now realizing also that we've been doing stars for a long time. We've been co-founders like 3 times. We have never had any of these conversations about why we do the things we're doing. We're just like doing them. um, okay, one of the things that I think is kind of like a good reason to start a startup, and again, I'm curious if you think this way. Startups always just sounded like a lot of fun to me. Like it just sounded like an adventure, and it was fun, and I knew it sounded like stressful and uncertainty and all of that kind of stuff, but it just seemed like a grand adventure, and that always appealed to me. Um, does that appeal to you? Does that make sense to you? Is that like a bad reason to start a startup?
I think it's great reason to start a startup. And I really don't want to dissuade people, but I feel like it's the
Mm,
catalyst, right? It's kind of like, oh, it's gonna be a grand adventure, and then like you step in, and then now you're like, crap, I'm in this gigantic forest of
yeah.
nothingness. What do I do? And so it very quickly goes away, but it's like one of the best catalysts.
And maybe just the like nuance here. I think it's like it's definitely a good catalyst. And I think that if you are starting a startup for this reason, I think the thing that you need to be able to find and figure out, which is I think what we've kind of been able to figure out, is that like can you have fun during even kind of like the tough times, right? And so bad stuff will kind of happen and you're still kind of like having fun because it's like part of this adventure. um you and I kind of talk about like sometimes being a founder is like you kind of have like a pirate ship and you're like trying to like find treasure somewhere and go somewhere. And being a pirate is like actually probably horrible 99% of the time. It's like you're running out of food and you get attacked by other pirates and all that kind of stuff. But there's like a part of that that just is like interesting and kind of like fun to kind of figure out. And so I think if it starting a start because it sounds fun is reasonable, the real trick to longevity is can you actually continue to have fun despite how kind of like bad things are going to get within the startup. Just and because I think for a lot of people, startups are not fun most of the time. I don't think you would characterize that. Like if you just took a poll of Brian and I in any kind of like moment in kind of a day, I don't know if we'd be like, oh my gosh, we're having so much fun. It's a lot of work and kind of stressful, which we'll kind of get into. But I think at the end of the day, both of us kind of think about our what we've done the last 15 years is like we've had quite a lot of fun. I think about it. Do you characterize it that way? I think one thing that maybe people are getting from this, which I think is interesting, is that Brian and I probably do startups for very different reasons. Like Brian is kind of like impact. I want to be able to like solve these big problems, that kind of stuff. And I think I'm like not actually that way. Like to me, I'm just like sounds fun. Like maybe I'm just like more indulgent, and I'm just like I want to have some fun. And so it just sounds fun, and I think it kind of ends up in similar places because it ends up being the case that if you work on hard problems, they're just more fun. Like I mean, when I studied math in school, it was like easy problems are not fun, and so it was like you just end up working on harder problems because they're just more interesting. There's more texture. There's like more to kind of work out there, and so I wonder if that's just like where we're kind of like coming out. Brian is like you're more impact driven. I'm more kind of like I want to have fun, and these things just seem like fun. And I think that's a good point to kind of bring to people
Yeah.
is that people get into startups for like a lot of different reasons, and so you just have to kind of figure out what yours is. There's not like one single kind of like piece here.